So today's lecture we'll be discussing epidemiologic study designs. So what we've been discussing before, in epidemiology, for you to be able to really explore and understand some of the things, it is really critical for you to understand study design. So for us to really understand the distribution of disease in terms of person, place, and time, and also to understand the risk factors as part of analytic epidemiology, we need to be able to, we do that in a systematic manner. And this systematic manner, we do it through use of epidemiologic study designs. So just to understand, in terms of epidemiology, some of the key fundamentals we need to understand: disease does not occur in a vacuum, and the disease is not randomly distributed throughout a population. There are few people within a population who will tend to have a disease. Not everyone will have a disease within a population. And for us to be able to really study some of those things, it is critical to make sure we use epidemiological principles. And by epidemiology, we are using systematic. We are doing a systematic approach to study the difference in diseases, the difference in distribution of disease in subgroup. If you're not systematic, you will not be able to pick these differences. So it also allows us to study causal and preventative factors. So to prevent and control disease, we need to do this in a coordinated manner. And this whole coordinated plan, usually we don't really, if you're suspecting, some disease which might be happening, initially what you need to have some hypothesis on, you need to have some hypothesis. So usually, I know we haven't discussed, maybe you've discussed hypothesis in some of your lectures, but an hypothesis is an intelligent guess. You need to have some suspect or some idea of whatever you think might be causing disease or might be related to the disease. So based on that hypothesis or that that intelligent guess of what might be causing a disease, you might then need to formally test that. And for you to test that, you can't do it in a haphazard manner, but you have to do it in a well-coordinated plan. And these plans on how you do it, they are what we call study designs. So study designs, they direct how the investigation is going to be conducted for you to understand whatever issues we should be looking at. So what are the components of epidemiology? I think we've discussed this. First, we need to measure the disease. We've discussed the measures of disease frequency. That's where we are quantifying the disease. Then we need to assess the distribution of the disease. Who is getting the disease? Where is the disease occurring? When is the disease occurring? That's our distribution. Then from assessing those things, we then formulate hypotheses. So by hypothesis now, when you say who is getting the disease, where are they getting the disease, when are they getting the disease, by really studying that, we can then formulate the hypothesis. Remember, as I said, hypothesis is an intelligent guess, and the next stage which will then go usually is now the relationship the relationship between disease and causal or preventative factors. So we want to see which of these factors might be causing disease. Which of these, remember, some factors might be causal, other factors might be preventative. As part of epidemiology or doing research, we need to understand both, because both sides are important. The causal, if you remove those things, it means people will no longer have disease. Then the preventative one, if you introduce those things, it means people will no longer have disease. Then from the hypothesis, what do? We identify determinants of what of the disease. These determinants can be either causal or can be what can be preventative. And how do you find this causal? We do this using what epidemiologic studies. So this is more of like really repeating and repeating again, but it's the same concept where we start by measuring the disease, we assess their distribution, we then identify the determinants. And for us to get determinants, we do that by using epidemiology, what epidemiologic studies. Based on the two types of epidemiology, we said we have two types, and epidemiology is mainly two branches where we have descriptive epidemiology and analytic epidemiology. So for descriptive epidemiology, we also have what we call descriptive studies, which really focuses on describing things. And mainly for descriptive studies, we're just worried about the occurrence of the outcome. They were not really looking at the relationship between between the outcome and anything else. We're just focusing on who is the disease, what is the person, the place, and the time. But analytic epidemiology, which for us to assess it, where we use analytic studies, we are now worried between the relationship between two things. In this case, we are worried with the relationship or the association between exposure and outcome. So our outcome is the disease. Then our exposure, remember, it can be risk factors or a cause or agent, or it can be something which prevents disease. So I want to see the relationship between this. We have a disease. What are the things which might put people at risk of getting disease? What are the things which might also reduce the risk of getting disease? So now we're going to discuss some of the basic research study designs in their application to epidemiology. So what designs exist to identify and investigate factors in disease? This slide summarizes almost most of the types of research of type of study designs which we use in epidemiology. So let's start from the top here, where we have got the first thing. Remember, as you're doing your epidemiological studies or clinical research, there are different types of clinical research. In some of the researches, we would mainly two type of research. They would experimental research or experimental studies and observational studies. Observational studies. So we have the concept of where we assign the exposure, and we assign the exposure to our study participants or to people who will be studying. In observational studies, we don't assign any exposure. We're just observing things as they are happening. But in case of experimental studies now, these are like studies where we let's say want to see the effect of something. Maybe another group we give them something, another group we don't give them something, and we want to see if want to see the effect of whatever we are giving. It can be a drug which we are giving to people. It can be immunization. It can be food or other things which you can give the group to try to really see the effect. So first, either you assign an exposure or you don't assign exposure. If you don't assign exposure, those are observational studies. If you are assigned an exposure, it's called what? Experimental study. Then for experimental studies now, it depends. Now, are you going to allocate these things at random? Whatever you're allocating, if you're giving a drug, are you going to use a random? We're going to discuss this in detail. Are you going to give whatever you're going to give at random, or you're going to have some criteria where you're giving? If you give it random, whatever you're giving, which means everyone has an equal chance of getting that, those are called now randomized controlled candidate trial. Then if you don't give it in random, those are those are non-randomized controlled trials. So usually randomized controlled trials, they are the gold standard if you want to see the relationship between exposure and and outcome. Then if you've got an observational study, the next question you need to ask yourself, you're just observing things, you're not giving anything. So the next thing you need to ask, do you have a comparison group? Are you comparing things? If you are not comparing, those are descriptive study. You are just looking in terms of place, person, and time. But if you are comparing, they become analytical studies now, and they become what? Analytic study, because you are what? Because you are comparing, and because there are two. You are comparing, and comparing two things, and you are comparing two what? And two groups. So if you're not comparing, those are descriptive studies. If you're comparing, it becomes what? Analytic study. Then we have got this, what we call the direction, and we have got what we call what? Direction. So the direction, it means, remember, for diseases and for disease to occur, and remember, for analytic, we are worried about relationship between outcome, energy, and the exposure. Outcome and what? And the exposure. So in the direction, we are saying, at what time are you assessing the relationship between exposure and outcome? If you are first assessing, and if you are first looking at if you are first looking at the outcome, and if you are first looking at the outcome, then you then go back to look for exposures, and these are called case control studies. Case control studies, you are getting your study participants based on the outcome, and based on the outcome, then you go and look for exposures. But for cohort studies, you start with what? You start with exposure. Then you look if the outcome is going to develop. So that's the difference between case control. You're starting with your outcome, looking for exposures, and then for cohorts, you expose things, you follow them up to see if the outcome is going to develop. Then for cross-sectional studies, you are assessing outcome and exposure at the same time. You are doing a cross-section where you're just assessing everything at the same time. So that's the difference between whatever, and the relationship between these two. I know it's a bit complex for you to understand these things, but with time you understand them. With our relationship, could we start from the top? Are you assigning the exposure, or you're not? If you're not assigning the exposure, that's observational. If you are assigning, that's experimental. Then when you are assigning, are you going to do that at random? If you do it at random, it becomes a randomized control clinical trial. If you're not doing it not at random, it becomes a non-randomized control clinical trial. Then for observational studies, remember, before I go to observational studies, just understand, for experimental, they're also called interventional studies, and they're putting an intervention. At the end, as you allocate whatever, you can have another group with the intervention, another group without intervention. Then for observational studies, and the first is their comparison. If there is no comparison, that's descriptive. If there is comparison, remember, if there's comparison, and that's descriptive. If there is no comparison, that's descriptive. If there is comparison, that's analytic. And you want to see the relationship between exposure and outcome. Then there's the issues of the direction. If you are selecting your study participants based on the outcome, that's a case control. If you are selecting based on the exposure, that's a cohort study. If you are assessing exposure and outcome at the same time, that's a cross-sectional study. Then you also need to understand this concept now. When you are doing our studies, there's the issue of time, and it's where we discuss time. So we have got what you call prospective study. Prospective study, it means you follow, it's about time, and so this is like the The study begins here, and then you follow up your study participants. Prospective, and it's going, it looks forward, it looks for the future, examines the future, follows a condition, concern, or disease into the future. You start with people either with disease or without disease, then you follow them up to see what happens and in them as time moves. Then retrospective, it means you're starting where you you have a time point, then you are looking backwards, and you are looking backwards, you are looking retrospective. You look back into the time to study events that have already occurred. That's a retrospective study. So your study begins here. You're doing your study here, but you're looking time, and it's time, backwards to see to assess, in terms of study events, if they've already occurred. So just to understand, in terms of, usually when you're conducting researches, there's this, there's this whole process of building up, and when you're doing a research, as you do your research, we have there's build up of things, which usually the first thing, these are like all the type of study designs and which we have. So usually we have what we call case reports. And case reports, let's take, for example, how this whole issue of corona started. Initially, it was one case which was in Wuhan, and so this case, it was, I don't know. I'll try to look for the first case, how it was reported, and it's to where there was this, maybe the first patient went to a seafood market. They then developed, the flu-like symptoms and all those things which are typical of corona, and so sooner after that, from a few cases, you can have a lot of cases developing, and when a lot of cases start developing, it then becomes a case series. Now you have a lot of cases which are now building. Now there are more of those cases now. Initially it was one case, but later you can then write cases of the same condition which are now emanating. If you've got a lot of these cases now, they are now, if you look, for example, let's come back even to Zimbabwe now, in terms of, initially we had a few cases, like one case, two cases, three cases. Now we've got more than 5,000 cases now at hand. From these cases, it is now possible to do descriptive epidemiology now, and where we can now describe, these things, who is affected, where are they affected, and at what time are they affected, because there are more. So during this whole process of having cases, then you go to case series and you go to descriptive. This stage is more of like hypothesis, and hypothesis formation, because you have the data which you are getting about whatever something which is happening. Then the more you start describing things now, and you are going to describe things, I always try to look back and give the examples of corona. But initially we realized that, from descriptive, we realized if you look in the age group, you realize most of the cases, in terms of the person, in terms of age, you realize most of the people who are dying, there are people who are above 50, above 60, 50, 60, and the elderly, they are the ones who are dying. Those with diabetes, those with other comorbidity, we are describing. The next stage which you need to move now is to go to analytic epidemiology now. Analytic epidemiology. We want to then assess now the relationship between getting corona, and from there, we're just describing, we are seeing. So you see more people who are having corona or who are dying from corona. They're the ones with diabetes. They're the ones who are elderly. They're the ones with hypertension. So the next thing is to do analytic studies, where we now want to see the relationship. In this case, our exposure, your age, your diabetes, your hypertension, and your comorbidity, and your outcome, which is death. And how can you do this? You can do this through a cohort, where you follow up people and see if they're going to develop, if they're going to die. You have your exposures, which are hypertension, your age, your diabetes, whatever, and you follow up those patients. Or you can do it as a case control. And you have case of deaths and the control. So your case and your control is someone who survived. Then you go back and look for the exposures. If they had hypertension, or if they had diabetes, or if they, their age. Then, or you can do a cross-sectional where you can just, describe all the people with corona and it one. Then the same also applies now, and there are some things now, it depends, and it's what I was discussing here. For clinical trials, I think we've had a lot of people now, they're trying to treat, corona. There are a lot of drugs which are coming. People are talking of chloroquine, people are talking of remdesivir, and many other drugs which people, interferon, which people are being discussed, which are used to treat, to test, to see actually if those things, if those things improve the outcomes of patients with corona. You can have the clinical trials where you then assign, and you can then assign your exposure. Now remember, we talk of assigning, and you give others, you give them chloroquine, others you don't give them chloroquine, and you see what is the outcome. Others you give them the remdesivir, and the drug which is being used to treat corona. You see the group with remdesivir, the group with chloroquine or without, and you see the outcome. There's also been talk of prednisolone. Either you give another group prednisolone, or another group you don't give the prednisolone, and you see what is you are assigning. Then those becomes clinical trials. So what I want you to really also, I left these two things before you usually go to some of these analytic studies. You might need to do animal studies or lab studies, and before you really go there, because you need to really see whatever you're giving or whatever you're trying to study, is it safe? So I think the point of all these things, for why I present this, is for you to, I wanted you to understand, to say the studies which we have, they are related and they fit into each other. And you start from from the lower level studies, which are the case reports. Then you go to case series, and then you go to descriptive. They fit into each other. Then as you go, you then need to do the complex things now to try to really test the relationship between between whatever you'll be looking. So just to summarize again, is the same concept which I'm saying, which is descriptive studies, case control studies, cohort studies, clinical analytic studies. Then descriptive studies, usually you'll be developing hypothesis, what you want to test. Case control studies, you're investigating relationships, and this is with outcome with exposure. Then case control cohort studies. Remember, case control, you are assessing what you have the outcome first, then you look for exposure. But for cohort studies, you start with your exposures and look for outcome. So you define its meaning with exposures. These ones, remember, there's always these issues in terms of the relationship. We're going to discuss it when we're discussing causality. In terms of the relationship, with which started, is it the exposure or it was the outcome which started? In case control studies, you can't, because you are assessing the outcome. Then we'll discuss this in detail. But for cohort studies, you can actually assess the relationship between outcome and the exposure. Then clinical trials, we are now testing whatever relationship which you might found experimentally. Then as you go down here, we have got increasing knowledge of the relationship of disease and exposure, or the relationship of outcome and exposure. That's why I say clinical trials, they are the gold standard in terms of understanding the relationship between outcome and exposure, because there's randomization and they are testing the things together. So I think this is the first part where we are just introducing study designs. Just describe, introducing the whole concept of study designs. We will have another recordings where we'll then discuss the descriptive studies in detail, and we also discuss analytic studies in detail.